Hello everyone and welcome. So arrows and bows are probably more dangerous than you may think. And in this video we're going to find out exactly why. Now of course bows and arrows have some obvious advantages over some other kinds of weapon like swords, axes or whatever other kind of weapon. First of which being that an arrow is shot from a long distance, and that means that you can usually get multiple shots on your opponent before he ever arrives to you, while with a sword or any other melee weapon you have to fight him and be attacked by him at the same time, so you don't get that advantage to get multiple attacks before he ever can attack you. Arrows, especially if shot by a heavy poundage bow, also have a very high penetrating power, meaning that they have a way higher chance of piercing through armor than most other kinds of weapon. Like a heavy warbow can rather easily shoot through mail armor, which is not easy at all for a sword, probably not even possible for a sword, depending on the sword of course, but most swords cannot go through mail armor. Arrows, if shot by a heavy warbow, they actually can. Now of course arrows have a high chance of killing you on the first shot if they do hit you, but that's kind of the case with any other kind of weapon. If I get thrust by a sword, I have a very high chance of being killed on one single blow, either immediately or after some time because I bleed out or something like that. But arrows actually have another advantage, and that is the fact that if I get hit by an arrow, the arrow is going to stick in me and actually stand like this while I try to do other things. And that is the main advantage of arrows. Arrows are basically very good at being a problem for you, even though they don't kill you and only wound you. A sword, if it hits you without killing you, is going to leave you with a wound that's going to bleed, that may get infected and stuff like that, and that clearly is going to be a problem for you. But if you are in the middle of melee, you just got hit, you will have a lot of adrenaline, and that means that you are probably not going to get very affected by that wound. You're of course going to get a little bit affected, but you actually have a high chance of actually being able to continue to fight with relative ease, just because it's only a wound and there's nothing protruding from that wound. If you get hit by an arrow, if I get an arrow like this, well, now I have the problem that since I have something protruding from my body, how do I fight with an arrow protruding from my body? It's not very easy, because if I try to attack, I have a certain chance of hitting the arrow that is stuck in my body. If I try to block, I have a certain chance of hitting it with my shield. Whatever I do, I have a high chance of hitting that arrow and thereby hurting me a lot. Also, the opponent can pretty easily hit that arrow, either on purpose or not even on purpose, and that is actually going to be a huge problem for me because, well, one, it's going to hurt a lot when that arrow moves around, and two, it's going to make the wound larger and more problematic when the arrow moves around. And of course you do have adrenaline that may affect it and not make you feel that much pain, and still allow you to fight perfectly well, even though you're hitting the arrow all the time and stuff like that. But the arrow is still going to make the wound deeper, harder to heal, and potentially lethal because it's moving around. Now an arrow can also break on impact when it actually hits you, and that means that you may have a broken arrow within you that can be even worse, because then you have wood splinters from the arrow making their own wounds within your body, potentially hitting some lethal place like an organ that may kill you, and just in general making the wound larger, bleeding more, and harder to heal. Now of course you could try to remove the arrow to not have that problem with the arrow protruding from your body and being penalizing. Now the fact is that removing an arrow from your body is actually really hard, because basically if you look at an arrow, so of course this is not a historical head or anything, but it's kind of the same for a historical head, at least for some of them. The arrow is creating a relatively round hole, and it's actually more than cutting a hole, it's actually tearing a hole a little bit, and that means that since you tear a hole, the hole will close in on itself much more easily than if you were cutting open the hole as you would do with a sword. And that means that the flesh around the arrow will actually hug it and keep it in your body and make it hard to draw out. And then you also have the fact that if you look at an arrowhead, the arrowhead is just a little bit wider than the shaft, meaning that you kind of have that ridge that needs to travel all through the flesh, and well, that's going to make it way harder to remove. Now you could also try to break the arrow, and well, breaking an arrow is relatively easy because, well, it's relatively light because it needs to be able to be shot by a bow. So yes, breaking an arrow is definitely possible. But the problem is that it's way harder to break it when it is stuck in your body. Partly because you have less leverage here than out here, and also because you can only use one hand, and your body is basically going to hold it in place. Now the problem is that the body is not going to hold it in place very well, and when you try to break it, it may actually just move around inside the wound, creating a bigger wound, and that is going to be a problem. And if you do succeed to break it, you may find yourself with the problem that the arrow has broken inside the wound, leaving you with splinters in the wound, which is horrible. And also, if you try to break an arrow while it's stuck in your body, it's going to hurt a lot, and most people will probably not be able to do it because there's just way too much pain. Also, you cannot really draw out a barbed arrow. So barbed arrow is basically this. So as you can see, instead of having a kind of a normal head, it has these barbs on the end, these kind of hooks, and they will actually hook up onto the flesh and make it impossible to draw out. So most arrows are theoretically possible to remove, but it is extremely hard to do it. And also, even if you're able to remove the arrow, it is not always a good idea to try to do it. First of all, it may make the arrow move, as I said, and that may make the wound lethal, simply because the arrow will hit an organ or a blood vessel or something like that, and may potentially kill you. Now, also some arrows did not have their head attached to the shaft. This was partially done to prevent the enemies from shooting back the arrows, because of course if you shoot an arrow, it misses and it's stuck in the ground. You could theoretically just draw it out from the ground and shoot it back at the one who shot it at you. But if the head falls off when that happens, well, now you can't shoot it back because the head is stuck in the ground. That is part of the reason, but the other reason is that prevented soldiers from removing the arrows in their bodies because, well, now you can relatively easily pull out the shaft. Problem is that if you pull out the shaft, the head is going to stay inside the wound. And that is a huge problem because it makes removing the head way harder later. The head may move inside the wound, potentially hitting a lethal part of your body and killing you. And just overall, it's way harder to remove the head later on, and that's a big issue. Now, do remember that barbed heads were always attached to the shaft, because when you have a barbed head, removing the arrows is basically impossible unless you have special tools, and therefore the enemies wanted the shaft to be stuck in you, because then you have the problem with the shaft without being able to remove it. So only non-barbed heads were not attached, and of course not all heads were loose, only some few of them. And this depends on the culture and stuff like that. Now, if you do manage to remove the arrow, whether the head stays in or the head gets out, you have the problem that will cause the wound to bleed more. Because basically the arrow acts basically like a sort of cork in the wound, preventing the blood from flowing out. If you remove it, you remove that cork and the blood can more freely flow out, which can definitely be a problem. Okay, so we have got a bottle of water here. Now the water inside is supposed to represent blood. So if I take an arrow and shoot at that bottle, well, we have a little bit of water spilling out. Now that water that is spilling out right now represents the blood loss you will have if you get shot by an arrow. Now the problem is that if you remove that arrow, now we suddenly have way more blood spilling out because, well, the arrow is not there anymore and not preventing any blood from falling out. And in the same way, if you remove an arrow that is stuck in you, you will have more blood loss, and that means it's not always a good idea to actually remove an arrow that is stuck in you. As you can see, we have the arrow in here, and if I turn the bottle upside down like this, we have a little bit of water spilling out. Now the fact is that the arrow itself kind of acts as a cork, preventing a lot of the water from actually spilling out. Now if I remove that arrow, you'll see we have way more of that water spilling out, and that is simply because the arrow cannot act as a cork anymore, and more water can just freely spill out. And this is one of the reasons why it's not always a good idea to remove an arrow from the wound, even though you can. And then you have the problem that you do not necessarily know what arrow you have been shot by. Therefore, if you try to pull on it, it might be a barbed arrow, meaning that you are going to wound yourself way more. It might be an arrow that has its head not attached, which means that you're going to be left with a head in your body, which is definitely not nice. Definitely not want that. So you don't necessarily know, so it's better to just be on the safe side and just not pull it out. And that is basically the main problem with arrows in general, the fact that they get stuck in you, and that causes a lot of complications and a lot of damage. Now the question is, how do you remove it safely? So you'll probably have heard of pushing the arrow through. So basically, if I'm here, I can push the arrow through, break the head off, and then pull it out. And that will mean that I can pull it out more easily because the head or the barbs of the head, if it's a barbed arrow, will not cause so much problems. This is extremely risky to do, and it was only very, very rarely done. Because basically you have the problem that if I'm hit like here, if I'm pushing it further through, I have a very high chance of the arrow actually hitting a large blood vessel or an organ or something like that, meaning that I may actually die from pushing the arrow through. Now, it was sometimes done if it was the only option you had, or if the arrow was very close to coming out on the other side in any case. Now, usually, whether it's a barbed or not barbed arrow, you actually have to widen the wound to be able to pull the arrow out. And that clearly is going to hurt you a lot. And is clearly not something you can do alone because it's just going to hurt way too much. And it is a risky process because you have to widen the wound, which means that you can cut open things that you should not cut open. Of course, you're watching out when you're doing that, and that's the good thing about actually widening the wound instead of pushing it through, because you can actually see what you're doing and do it more safely. Now, for barbed arrows, we sometimes hear of goose feathers that are used to remove them. And how that is supposed to work is that you have a goose feather, and it's actually hollow, right? And you will actually insert that in the wound, put it on the barb, and now the barbs aren't actually hooking into the flesh anymore, and thereby you can pull it out. There is no actual historical evidence for that, so maybe they did it, but we can't really know, and well, we have no evidence of it, so we don't really know. Usually it was just cut the wound a little bit larger open to be able to extract the arrow. Now, special tools were also sometimes made. For example, we have the story of Prince Henry, so later Henry V, that was shot in the face by an arrow in the Battle of Tewkesbury. Something like that. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but the Battle of something. Now the shaft of that arrow was not attached, which means that they pulled out the shaft, but the head actually stuck inside the face, and they had to get a way to remove that. Now, we don't really know what kind of head it was. It was probably not a barbed arrow, since the shaft was not attached, but it might have been. We don't really know. It was probably just a normal bodkin or armor-piercing arrow or something like that. Now, the problem with the face is that you cannot really easily widen the wound because, well, you have a lot of bones in the face and a lot of very important body parts like eyes, nose, and mouth and stuff like that, and brain. So extremely hard to remove an arrow from the face. Now, what the surgeons did was to actually create a special tool to remove the arrow. And what that special tool was is a kind of opposite pincer, basically. So it is starting small. You insert it inside the socket of the arrow head, and then by screwing on something on the back, you will actually widen out these two pincer things to actually clamp the arrowhead, and then you can pull it out. Now, still with that, pulling it out was extremely hard, and they did still need to widen the wound, even though they had a special method for clamping it. Now, the fact is that they invented a new special tool to remove that arrow, which probably means that most other people that got shot in the face, which probably wasn't that uncommon, actually just died because they didn't have any way to remove that arrow. And the only reason why they did that for Prince Henry was that he was a prince, so a very important character, and well, therefore healing him was way more important. Fact is that probably most commoners or normal soldiers just basically died if they got an arrow in the face, no matter if the arrow killed them instantly or not. Now finally, the dangerous thing about arrows is that since they stay in the wound, all sorts of bacteria have a way higher chance of getting from the arrow to the flesh, and that means that you actually have way higher chances of getting an infection from an arrow than from something like a sword. So in the end, arrows are very, very dangerous for obvious reasons, like the fact that they are being shot from a distance. You can be shot by a lot of arrows before ever arriving to your opponent. They have a very high penetration power to penetrate through armor, but the main thing that makes an arrow more dangerous than another weapon like a sword is the fact that the arrow is stuck in your body and is extremely hard to remove. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video, and well, now I have to find a way to get this arrow out. Yeah.